Hello, grade 28 facilitators. I hope your study on the two words is going well. Today we look at lesson 6. And so we open with 3 different quotes to just begin some discussion. One of the things we've been doing in this is looking at the role and function of the law in God's promises or the gospel in the scriptures and the importance of distinguishing those. So today we get into looking a little bit deeper into the Word, trying to understand it against the contrast of the Reformation alarm that we could maybe in some way be saved by something that we do, and the clarity that the gospel brought that we're saved by the work of Christ and what He has done on our behalf. And so this study aims to get into looking at the relationship between faith in the promises. Okay, and so we're looking at some things as it relates to, say, the sacrament at the beginning, that just the outward performance of the sacrament doesn't save, but faith in the promises that God delivers in the sacraments is what's critical and what's important. And so we're going to look at a couple different passages, but the main passage comes from Romans 4:13 to 25, and this is a look at Abraham and his faith in him believing and trusting in God's word and his promises. But we're emphasizing that faith is active and it does cling to and it does trust God's promises. Okay, so while we are saved by the work of Christ alone, we do in faith receive the gift of baptism. We receive the Lord's Supper, and we in faith believe that God is giving what He promises in that meal. Okay? So, as you move through that first passage in Romans 4, you'll be asked to look at a total of 5 verses more closely. Verse 16, we look at faith according to verse 16. You must believe means you must accept what is offered to you. And accepting a gift is not a work through which you earn the gift. And so you're going to be encouraged to say, so what is it then? And it would be a receiving of that gift. So in other words, think of, right, if you came to a beggar who needed food and you decided to drop food or to put food in his hand, and he moves his hands and lets it fall to the ground and doesn't pick it up, well then he's robbed of the gift because he didn't receive it. Okay? So we're going to move through that in verses 20 to 21, verses 24 to 25. Show that our justification rests upon faith and trusting in what Jesus has done. So basically the parallel in what Paul does is show you that just as Abraham believed and was credited to him as righteousness, so we today believe and actively have faith in Jesus and what He has done and promised through the Word, and are thus justified. Okay, so faith is active. Okay, in that respect. Then we move into the deepened section, Matthew 26, chapter 26, verses 26 through 28. This is the institution of the Lord's Supper, and you have Jesus say that we have forgiveness of sins. And so what this plays out is when we come up to the altar to receive the Lord's body and blood, we actively believe, and in faith believe we're having the forgiveness of sins. Take faith out of the equation and don't trust that and don't believe that, and you're not receiving that in the meal just because you eat it and eat the body and drink the blood, okay, or the bread and the wine. Then we go on to a little in the deliver section, Mark 16:16. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. And so what we're trying to flesh out here a little bit is what's the most necessary thing in this verse, which is faith, okay? But this also shows that even if a person were unable to be baptized, he is still saved as long as he what? Believed, because the only thing that condemns is unbelief. Then we have a great passage from 1 Peter, Peter Burrow's favorite book of the Bible, next to 2 Peter, chapter 3, verse 21. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not the removal of filth of the flesh, but the pledge of a good conscience toward God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So, what is faith trusting in as it relates to baptism? So faith is trusting to what God delivered and does in baptism. Okay, so it's not just the work of baptism that saves. It's the faith in the promise of what God is doing in baptism that saves. Okay? And then there's a pray together section which comes from the catechism. And I like this because I've italicized some things that emphasize something that we often forget when we talk about baptism. Sometimes we get very exclusionary and separate faith for some reason from the gift of baptism, what God's doing. Here we see how in this explanation that the Lord forgives sins, rescues from death and the devil, and gives eternal salvation to all who believe this, as the word and the promises of God declared. So again, kind of as a summary, we're looking at faith, trusting and clinging to the word and the promise, and that being the significant thing. Okay, and looking at faith not necessarily as a work, but as actively receiving that which God gives out. So I think you'll see some of the tensions play out early on in this because of some maybe poor teaching in the Lutheran Church of something like baptism saves and all you need is your baptism certificate, and then you get into heaven. Well, this kind of leaves off the active faith part and believing and trusting and growing in what was given to you in baptism and all those sorts of things. And so hopefully this brings those things to the surface for clarity so that we're not kind of reducing baptism to something less than what it is, or forgetting to realize the importance of faith in the process of baptism. Okay? And then last, actually I'm going back to the very beginning, the last point to discuss, the absence of faith is a human work, but the presence of faith is a divine work. Okay? So wrestle through this. I think it'll be a good one. I think you'll really have some lively discussion as to thinking of faith clinging to the promises, not just the promises. Okay? Have a good study. Talk to you next week.